Hello church, here we are in Ezekiel chapter 8, 9, and 10. And I just love it because these chapters we give us a glimpse into the spirit world. And Ezekiel is trying to describe things here in human terms that can't quite be described and can't quite be comprehended by, especially by people who haven't seen them, and yet he's trying to do it. And I just want to show you something as you think about that. If you look at Ezekiel chapter 10, verse 12 to 14, and you read these creatures with the wings and eyes and the multiple faces or the different faces, and very similar to what he described in Ezekiel chapter 1, they are actually, I want you to be able to realize this, very similar to the same creatures that John sees in heaven in Revelation chapter 4. And if you haven't made that connection before, it's worth going to check it in Revelation, because you realize that both of these guys are getting a glimpse into the spirit world in heaven, and it's those creatures that are bowing down to the Lord and just worshiping him day and night forever and ever, saying, holy, holy, holy. It's just an incredible, incredible thing. And it ties the Bible together in a beautiful and wonderful way. Then I want to see something in chapter 8 and chapter 10 that has everything to do with the presence of God. So we know, when we think about, you could ask a simple question, is God omnipresent? And of course he is. We know that based on passages like Psalm 139, for instance, that God is omnipresent. There is no place that you can go to hide from him or escape from him. He knows all and sees everything, whether you're in the darkness or whatever. Nothing is hidden from God's sight. He knows all and always sees. And in that sense, he is absolutely omnipresent. And yet, is his manifested presence equal everywhere? No, it isn't. Because, and one way of explaining his manifested presence would be to be in the state of experiencing his blessing and favor and glory. And in that place, is that equal everywhere? No, it isn't. If we think about places like Exodus chapter 33, Moses didn't want to leave the dry, dusty desert because he didn't want to go unless the Lord's presence was coming with him. He wanted to be in that place of the blessing, favor, and glory of God. If we think about Numbers chapter 14, there was a time that the Israelites should not go and fight because God was not with them. It didn't mean that he had stopped being omnipresent. It just meant that his blessing and favor was not with them in that time. And we can even see it in chapter 10, that the glory, the manifested glory of God is moving. Here in chapter 10, verse 4, and then in verse 18 to 19, the glory of God moves from the threshold of the temple to above the cherubim, and then back in verse 18 and 19, back from the cherubim to the threshold of the temple, and so on. And you can see that the glory of God, the manifested glory, is moving, and in more in one place than it is in another. And so this brings us to chapter 8, verse 6, that these people in Israel have acted in such a way that it describes their actions as having driven God from his sanctuary. That does not mean that God stopped being omnipresent. It means that his blessing, favor, and glory are now no longer in his temple. Isn't that an incredibly sad thing, church? Can you imagine attending a church or just being a people who don't experience the glory of God? How sad would that be, that people go from being his chosen people to not even appreciating, or maybe they just took for granted his presence? How sad is that? In John 14, Jesus said that he would reveal himself to those people who love him and obey him. Again, it's not equal for everybody on the planet, but his manifested glory is reserved for those. And in Numbers chapter 6, this is the priestly blessing. Part of that blessing that the priest would pray on people would be that God's grace, his face would shine upon them and he'd be gracious to them. Not everybody gets that, but we should be those people who want to receive that kind of a blessing. And James chapter 4 has a very plain way of saying it. It says that if you come near to God, he will come near to you. We should desire that nearness and that presence of God. And so we might just pray based on those things, even out of Ezekiel, connecting to all these other places in the Bible, maybe launching from Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 6, and say, Lord Jesus, help me to never act in a way that drives your presence from me. And then you might even follow that up with the Lord and ask him some questions about if there's anything in your life that would lend itself towards driving his presence from your life, or if you actually hunger and crave it and are welcoming his presence and desiring it. So spend some time with the Lord on that. And then in chapter 9, I actually I love the imagery of this chapter with these 6 warrior guys, and I would love to see them. They probably look very imposing and intimidating. And then they're together with this other guy who's got a writing tool, and he's going around putting marks on the righteous people. And it reminds me of the story of Noah and the ark in Genesis chapter 6. Jesus referred to something similar that's going to happen in the end times in Matthew 24. But it reminds us that the righteous are saved. But what is very striking to me and somewhat sobering to us is that if you and I are those who are righteous, look at where it says the judgment will start. Here in verse 6, it talks about where does God's judgment start? It says, begin at my sanctuary. That lines up with 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 17 that says exactly the same thing. Judgment will start in the house of the Lord. And it starts with us. And so one thing you and I ought to ask is, Lord Jesus, is there sin in my life? Because sin has a way of creeping into the church or even into the lives of those people who should be righteous and are righteous, actually, covered by Jesus' blood. And yet, if we're not careful and diligent, we need to constantly be in a place where we're asking the Lord, like Psalm 139 also says, to examine my heart. Search me, Lord. I just want to make sure that there is nothing in my life that is sinful or even hindering me from experiencing your presence and knowing you. And so just ask God that question today and spend time with him and be thankful that you and I get to be righteous because of his blood. Talk to him about that today. Celebrate your day with Jesus.